Hi, my name is David Martin and I'm joined today by my co-host Craig Patterson. This is the Heads and Horizons podcast, where we and our guests discuss the challenges of leadership and how, with a little professional help and support, leaders can better navigate change, deal with organisational complexity and create a more productive and engaging work environment leading to higher team performance.
Hi, and welcome back to Heads and Horizons. I'm Craig Patterson, former Chief People and Technology Officer, and I'm here with Dave Martin, a former tech sales leader. We're both now executive coaches, working with senior leaders, navigating real-world challenges at the top. And we're back now for, believe it or not, episode 3. And today we're going to be diving into a topic that doesn't get discussed enough, especially in leadership circles, and that's about leading through self-doubt. What happens when the leader feels lost? Even the most capable, experienced leaders can hit moments where they feel disconnected, unsure or stuck. And because they're the only ones others rely on, they sometimes feel they can't admit it, even to themselves. In this episode, we're going to explore how self-doubt shows up behind the scenes and why it's rarely spoken about, and how coaching can help leaders reconnect with clarity and confidence. So Dave, let's get into it. And The first question goes over to you. So what does self-doubt actually look like at the top in your view? And how is it different from imposter syndrome?
So, probably fair to say that most of us have experienced self-doubt at some time. At its most extreme, it can be quite crippling in actual fact. And I can certainly think of situations, points in my own career where that was me. Looking back, I can see how I was, second guessing so many things, massively overthinking almost everything to a degree of almost inertia. I stopped taking the risk that I used to do so naturally, and that fear of failure, fear of the consequences I thought would follow if I got stuff even marginally wrong, just about took over. I was just second guessing everything. But if I can quickly talk about the consequences as well, Craig, because I think that's equally important, because it doesn't just affect you; it affects all those around you as well. The folks who are relying on you to take those big, bold decisions, make the big calls. And to a certain extent, live up to that, external strong man or woman persona that you're probably trying to give off, whilst at the same time probably quietly crumbling underneath. And then it's actually so hard to break out of, really hard. But you also asked me how self-doubt differs from imposter syndrome too. And look, I think there are a lot of similarities, and I've certainly experienced that too. But I think imposter syndrome, if anything, is actually more chronic. It's that persistent belief that you're a fraud, often despite clear evidence to the contrary, clear evidence of competence and success. It's that intense fear of being exposed as somehow unqualified or incompetent. And just like that lack of self-belief, imposter syndrome can be hard to step away from. So, forgive me for bringing it up, but it would be remiss of me at this point not to mention how a good coach can really help in situations like this, helping to reframe that self-defeating narrative that's holding you back. And by providing an empathetic and supportive framework for you to see yourself in a different place where whatever your true potential is, that comes to the fore again. So sorry, that was probably a bit of a long answer, but there were sort of 2 or 3 questions wrapped up into one there in reality, Craig. So that's my thinking. What about yours?
Yeah, I think that there are, as you said, those similarities between self-doubt and imposter syndrome. But I think I'd agree with you that I think imposter syndrome may be that bit more disabling, and self-doubt might be momentarily. Maybe just for our purposes, it's useful to have that distinction. But I'd absolutely agree with you that it can be really limiting in many, many ways, and so unlocking that is really important.
Yeah, so true, so true. So look, question for you then, Craig, if that's okay. So why is self-doubt so hidden in senior leadership, and what's the cost of not naming it, in your opinion?
Well, I think we've touched on some of this, Dave, in what you were talking about. But it's not maybe the done thing for a senior leader to admit self-doubt. I think particularly if you're leading people, or you're, let's say, at a board meeting, if you were to start expressing self-doubt, I think it's going to be quite limiting for you. Now, some people, and maybe it should be seen as a strength. But I think that in reality, it's far better to think about how you can deal with those self-limiting beliefs, perhaps outside of situations like that. And again, like you said, a bit of a plug for executive coaching here is that gives the space and the confidentiality and trust to be able to do that if you've got the right coach. I think leadership is lonely, and I think leaders sometimes lack the space, the safe space to be able to really express themselves with certainty. I think it can start to look like a competence issue. It may only be fleeting, but it can start looking like competence. It can actually also look like it can create a level of instability for the business, which obviously could have an impact upon both employee sentiment, but also investor, stakeholder sentiment. So, not calling it out, not naming it, for yourself is really potentially career limiting and extremely damaging. So I'd urge people that are feeling like this that, think about how you're going to deal with it in a proactive way, because probably it's not just going to disappear.
Yes, so true, and that's just provoking some thoughts in my mind as well, Craig. You mentioned, the loneliness there, of the loneliness of leadership, and you and I have touched on this many times previously, and the difficulty a lot of leaders have in expressing some of their emotions. I mean, you just look at some of the negative reaction that we've seen over the last 24 hours to our own Chancellor here in the UK, proving that, she's not free of emotions, in the House of Commons. I think that's just a very public manifestation of some of the challenges that exist around this particular topic. So yeah, good wise words there, Craig.
Completely, and it's very timely, Dave, isn't it? Because there we go. Everybody's jumped on the fact that that's a weakness. Her expressing that. That was the conclusion that I certainly read in all the media, was that it was inappropriate and a weakness. But then I thought about what else that individual could have done, and I think probably whether she'd been there or not would have made no difference. But moving on to our third question, and this is one for you, Dave. So can you share an example, of a leader who seemed confident was stuck in self-doubt, and what shifted for them?
So I'm actually working with someone right now. It's in the context of a group coaching environment rather than one-to-one, to be fair. And the lady in question clearly recognised herself that the issues that she has around self-confidence. And actually, not unlike many people in a similar state of mind, she's actually in a really, really good, high-profile role in the legal sector as it happens, and clearly has an abundance of talent and capability. And whilst I can't say that she has possibly or ever will totally overcome these lingering doubts, working in a group environment has actually really worked well for her, because she's had to confront and acknowledge the reality of her situation. And the reality being that not just I as a coach, sort of my job, and you might expect me to operate and act in a certain way, but not just I as a coach, but the other people in the group just don't see what she sees in the mirror. And that's being reflected back to her, if that's not too many mixed metaphors there. And that's to the point that she's now starting to reassess how she looks at things and approaches things. She looks more now, or is at least starting to look more now, to be precise, at what she's truly capable of. That's much more her default position now than it ever was. So rather than approaching everything with the mindset of, what she isn't capable of, she's learning to be less of a people pleaser. That desire many of us have to say yes to everything and anything, which is actually incredibly draining, emotionally draining. Instead, she's working on being less reactive and being more confident and willing to say no, or at least give due diligence and due consideration before saying yes, at the very least. So yeah, she's definitely someone I can think of who has a confident veneer on the exterior, but masking self-doubt underneath.
Yeah, great example. Funnily enough, we talked about this earlier in the week when we were prepping for this podcast, but, I by chance spoke to somebody yesterday who was very aware of the physical issue that they have, that I'd actually never noticed. And I think, again, it reinforces that fact that sometimes we can be more self-aware of some of this that's going on than actually others see. And I think that's really important to maybe bring out here, But it's funny how, when you're talking about things or looking at things, you notice this when you go about your daily business.
Yeah, that's so true. When you actually drill into it, people just don't see what you see in the mirror. So true.
Yeah, absolutely.
So, question for you then, Craig. How do you personally catch yourself when you're in self doubt, when you're in a self doubt spiral, and what helps?
Look, I mean, I think if people are honest, we can all be in this from time to time. It is only you, in my view, that's going to truly get you out of it. But I think there are mechanisms that you can employ to help you get there more quickly. I think the first is recognizing it. And that could come through you just maybe being a bit more hesitant about things that you're working on, maybe a little bit less decisive. Maybe a tightness in the chest, maybe a feeling of, a bit of stress or headaches. Um, in terms of, I think it's then about saying to yourself that, what's really driving this? Is it that I'm just maybe not prioritizing properly? Is it I'm trying to do too much? Is it that I have got that self-doubt and I'm beginning to wonder whether I'm the right person to do this? Do I have the skills, the tools, the experience? Um, One thing that can be useful, I've found, is writing things down. And a lot of people call this journaling, which is where you just sort of basically take a pen and paper and you just make your notes and you just sort of, just list out your experiences. But it can look in many different ways for different people. But it could just be literally writing down a load of bullet points or whatever way you feel works for you. But if it's to do with self-doubt, it helps you to reframe that and perhaps put it into a little bit more perspective. Another thing, and Dave, you and I have used this with one another quite a lot as well, is about speaking to people that you trust. So who else do you know that's in a similar sort of situation, or would have been in similar situations, maybe is experiencing or experience what you're going through? And I think, therefore, if you've got people that you know that you can trust in that way, it's a safe space, again, where you've got people that understand what you're going through. It's difficult for everyone to understand people's self-doubt if it's something they've never experienced or they don't touch in any way. But I think the other thing is to just be a little bit kinder to yourself. And I've employed this of late. And it's a very small thing. And I do think that real change actually always gets affected by small steps. I think it's much more realistic to give yourself small steps than to think you're suddenly going to overcome self-doubt overnight. One of the things I've done around just catching myself when I'm in that self-doubt spiral is taking time away from the computer, taking time away from the office, and just going out into the fresh air. Just taking that 10 minutes to go and grab a cup of tea, away from the screen. Those are some of the sort of things that I've employed. But keen to know if there's anything you'd add to that, Dave, or anything else, or anything indeed that resonates with you.
Yeah, certainly. I never used to call it this, but I've for a long time now, actually spent time just writing things down, just almost like a mini diary to a certain extent. And I've always found that very, very cathartic. Of course, we now know that as journaling, and you referred to that, Craig. So that's something that if folks haven't tried it, I would certainly encourage people to take some time and just to write down what's going on, what's happening for them. And as I say, I find that such a cathartic exercise and have done for a long period of time. And just a little story, just along the lines of what you were talking about there. I was thinking myself some time ago, coaching leaders. What gives me, and I know coaching is a non-directive discipline, but even putting that to one side, what gives me the right to coach, some really fantastic people, some fantastic leaders, around their future. I don't recall my own leadership skills ever being compared to Churchill's, for instance, or being responsible for a unicorn startup or getting on a FTSE 100 board, for instance. So what gives me the right to coach some really tremendously skilled people? Well, the thing is, it doesn't actually matter. And I was just actually reading something, reminded about, to use a footballing analogy, about the great Arrigo Sacchi, considered to be the finest footballing manager never to have played the game professionally. So, just because you weren't the finest at any one particular thing doesn't mean that you still can't provide real value to people in lots and lots and lots of different ways.
Absolutely. I quite agree. And look, we're coming up to, we've got to always be mindful of the clock. I'm going to say that this time instead of yourself, Dave. But with that in mind, we've got one final question I think we'll both have a go at, which is, what advice would you give to a capable leader who doesn't feel like one right now? Do you want to go first on that?
Yeah, I'll go first on that. So simply, I'd advise taking some peer feedback, whether that's done formally within the framework of a formal HR program, and I've worked for organisations that did have formal programs around peer feedback. So, take some peer feedback, either formally or even informally, over a coffee or a glass of wine or whatever works for you. I encourage anyone questioning their own capabilities or credentials, to ask their trusted peers, what they experience and what they see when working with them. Because, they may well be very, very surprised, positively surprised. Again, they may find that people just don't see the same thing that they do when looking in the mirror. So peer feedback, I would say, would be the one thing I would suggest there.
Yeah, excellent. I think what I would probably say is that, it's not necessarily a constant position. It is more likely that it's a passing situation.
Mm-hmm.
We all know when we've maybe reacted or overreacted to something. And just be kind, just give yourself that opportunity to step back from the situation. And remember, nobody's perfect. I think another thing is to just, make sure that you name the issue, name it, call it out, or write it down, as we've said, so that you begin to own it a little bit more, rather than it just be a load of words going around in your head that actually could just manifest themselves into a lot worse than it actually is. But there's a reason why you got to where you were. Remember that. Remember all those times when things have gone well. And how can you draw on those experiences and actually, almost in a way, use those as a bit of a fire blanket to smother out some of those, perhaps those little flames of self-doubt. Because, there will be, I guarantee there will be examples in the past that you can draw on where things have actually gone really well, even in situations where you've suffered self-doubt or you haven't had the answer.
Absolutely, for sure. Well, look, Craig, fascinating chat as always. And before we draw matters to a close, I think it would be wrong of me to close today's session without circling back to the discussion we had last time, and that was around tomatoes. So, like anybody who listened to episode 2 and is listening to this one as well, we're all on tenterhooks to know how the tomatoes are going, Craig.
Well, yeah, okay. I think I'm safe to say that, I think that I might get one salad. I don't think I'm going to be going into business anytime soon as a tomato grower, but it's been an exercise in care and love. Whether that repays, time will tell. Maybe on the next episode.
Well,
we'll have better news.
Indeed, we look forward to the update. So, well, look, thanks to you and anyone who's listened, and we look forward to an update in episode 4. We hope that you found. We hope that if you have listened, we hope that you found the content insightful enough to want to subscribe on whatever platform you're accessing it from. So please do follow and subscribe, and we look forward to welcoming you back for episode 4 of Heads and Horizons, which I believe we're discussing culture, conflict, and courage. How do you lead when the easy options to stay silent? So, looking forward to episode 4. So, thanks, Craig, and thanks to everybody for listening.